The end of chocolate, it's an intriguing concept. What does it mean?
It doesn't go with Doritos, by the way. I just want to point out to the graphic we just pulled up, it does not go chocolate.
Lots of junk food goes well with
Doritos and chocolate do not go
hard enough.
Okay, end of chocolate.
And
Explain.
it's not disappearing. We are facing the end of cheap chocolate. We have always been used to chocolate being abundant, available. There is a tremendous amount of pressure on chocolate coming from all sides. So this delicious treat that we all love is going to get more expensive.
Why?
There's many sides to this. Let's talk about supply. Disease is a major threat to chocolate. It comes from a tree, not a small plant like corn or tomatoes, so it takes a long time to breed, to improve, gets ravaged by disease. Global warming is a threat. Farmers in emerging parts of the world are finding alternative crops, things they can make more money on today, things like corn, things like rubber. There is a supply constraint on chocolate.
So one of the things I learned from your story is that Ivory and Ghana and the Ivory Coast make like almost half of the chocolate, or a little bit more, in fact.
A huge amount. 70% comes from Africa.
Why can't they stop the spread of disease into these heavy chocolate?
It takes a very long time to improve chocolate to make it disease resistant. It takes about 3 years before you get fruit. It takes about 10 years before you know if you've got a decent plant. So unlike corn, it just takes forever. Now the other side of this, though, is demand. It's spiking. So while supply gets tighter, the Chinese, for example, always our favorite example of an emerging economy, are eating more and more chocolate. In the last few years, they've doubled their consumption. Per capita, they're still only at 2% of what we eat. So just imagine if people in China start to eat half as much chocolate as we do, what is that going to do to demand?
Mark, I wanted to get a chocolatier's perspective on this story. Todd Masonis is the co-founder of Dandelion Chocolate. He's in our San Francisco bureau. Todd, do you find yourself confronting some of the factors that Mark is explaining to us, that chocolate is rising in price, but in particular good chocolate is becoming more expensive?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the things that he mentioned are true, although I think that the case for the chocolate shortage is a bit overstated. You know, I've been reading all about the so-called choc apocalypse, this idea that by 2020 the world's going to run out of chocolate. And I think the headlines are just a little bit overstated. In fact, you know, two of the biggest players in this story, the International Cocoa Organization, Barry Callebaut, both put out statements last week effectively saying, hey, it's actually not quite that bad and they had been misinterpreted. You know, I think there definitely is going to be a gap between supply and demand, but like any other commodity, what happens when demand increases and supply does not is the prices go up. The prices go up, the farmers get interested in planting more trees. They plant more trees, we get more beans, and in a few years things stabilize. So historically there's been this tight coupling between supply and demand. And so I don't think we're particularly worried, and especially for us, you know, we don't buy commodity beans. We already pay 2 to 4 times the commodity price, and so, you know, having the farmers get paid a little bit more for chocolate is actually not such a bad thing.
I think farmers getting paid more for chocolate is great, but the problem here is there's only so much land, and the cure to this problem could be even bigger than the problem, which is that as we try to produce more chocolate, we're going to start selecting strains that are more abundant. That's already happening. It's happening in South America with a strain called CCN51, and it's happening in Africa. These varieties give you a lot of cocoa. It just doesn't taste very good. So what we're going to end up doing is the same thing we did to strawberries and tomatoes and chicken. We're going to make it taste worse. So we will have a lot of chocolate.
I've always wondered about this because I lived in Germany for a decade, in Switzerland, and they would always accuse, for example, the English of selling fake chocolate with the big English brand. There are just different levels of chocolate, right? There's not some kind of fake chocolate that goes in an Easter egg.
Well, they have all sorts of rules, especially in Europe, about what constitutes true chocolate. The Belgians say what the British eat is candy. But at some point, it does come down to quality. Africa is a huge producer, and if they start to dilute the quality of what they make, everybody's going to feel that. Maybe not so much the fine makers. They can afford to buy those boutique beans from this or that part of the world, but overall, we're going to feel it.
Todd, given that you don't buy commodity chocolate, you buy the best stuff that's available, do you have some concern about the quality of the plant that these farmers are going to put in the ground in order to meet or you know, to address the supply-demand imbalance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a real concern, and I think that, you know, basically there's sort of a distinction in the market. On the one hand, you have sort of the commodity market, and you do have these strains where all you're really worried about is how do you get as many beans as possible, how do you increase your yield. And I think that's a real concern because, CCN 51, as was mentioned, actually doesn't taste very good. But, I think the big industrial makers really are concerned with how do you just get enough supply and how do you make something cheap and consistent. And I think on the other end of the spectrum, there's sort of an explosion of new American craft chocolate makers that are starting to treat chocolate more like wine or coffee. Chocolate can actually have more flavor complexity than wine. But, for the last 50 years, people have been really concerned with trying to get rid of anything that's interesting about it. And so I think, when we work directly with farmers, they're pretty proud of what they plant, and they're already getting paid a fair wage. And so, there's actually a whole bunch of people out there trying to find new and interesting strains of chocolate. And I think that's really the future of chocolate because people are willing to pay more for that, and farmers are willing to plant that. And that's pretty different than the commodity market.